session of the Past and Future of the World Council of Anthropological Associations. And now we have the session called Discussing the WCAA. What did it change? What do we need? It's also a pleasure to have Virginia Dominguez to start the session. Please, Virginia.
Thank you. Okay, can anybody here dim those lights? Oh. No?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, now in the dark. Well, one problem or the other. Anyway, it's very nice to be here. It's very nice to have you here in the audience. It's terrific that Gustavo organized yet another thing here. So I don't know if you got lots of arm twisting, but thank you again for doing this. I should explain both to people who are here who don't have a long history of the WCAA, or even people who are here who have a partial history with the WCAA, that I am unlike all 5 previous speakers in that I don't go back to the originary moment of the founding of the WCAA, but I realize in retrospect that I have spent probably about half of the life of at least 5 years, if not 6 years, of the life of WCAA in various roles and capacities, from what was then called President-elect, which is now Vice President, President-elect of the American Anthropological Association, to my 2 years as President of the American Anthropological Association, to being put in the position of Chair of the WCAA Task Force that has a very long name, Advocacy and Outreach Activities. And I guess in this role that you play, Gustavo, as well as several of us of past delegates, members. But that's interesting and important because I think my tack, my approach to this particular time up here in the podium is both a little bit more critical, perhaps, than some of the founders have been, while at the same time quite supportive of the WCAA. So what I, in fact, want to do has a real practical dimension, and I think it dovetails nicely with SETHA, but in many ways it's really about vision and purpose, and in the ways in which I have written this intervention, it probably looks less practical, but I don't mean it as less practical. I just think that one of the main things that's an issue for the WCAA is to try to figure out what it's trying to do. And I don't say that without support for the effort. But in any case, let me read what I wrote, and I think some of you might have read it. I circulated it ahead of time, but I still think it would be useful to read it as such. So this presentation considers different ways of conceiving of what the WCAA has been pursuing. I want you to notice my verbs. Has been pursuing. I will contemplate a number of different models. Actually, a number of different possibilities, ranging from the pursuit of internationalization to the pursuit of multinationalism, or transnationalism, or polylogy, or heterology, to invoke Todorov. But it asks us to think about what each of these terms, actually concepts, evokes, what hopes accompany their evocation, and among whom. I don't treat any of these as synonyms. I treat them as possibilities with different strengths, different weaknesses, different goals, and frequently different unseen strategies and tactics. I don't even think that any one of them needs to be the one thing that the WCAA pursues now and throughout its future. I don't think it needs to be the permanent goal or direction of the WCAA, to put it differently, or even the one exalted paradigm for us as a whole, or even for us as nationally located participants of the anthropological profession. But I do think that it is quite important to ask these questions, perhaps to attempt to answer them, but certainly at least to ask these questions, that is, to try to identify what it is that the WCAA has been trying to achieve, what it is that it might have achieved, what it is that it has not achieved, and what it is that we may now seek to achieve. Sometimes fuzziness. Some colleagues in cognitive anthropology who like to talk about fuzziness. Sometimes fuzziness, but we can think of it as ambiguity, works best in order to get something started, or at least to get outside a particular way of thinking, a particular mold. For example, and this may seem irrelevant, but in my mind it's not, I remember how for many years the word chosen in Israel when speaking of something other than domination or occupation for Palestinians was autonomia. Sound familiar? It's not a Hebrew word, and it's not an Arabic word, but it was very clearly borrowed from another language in many ways because it couldn't be pinpointed. The choice of word was not accidental. What it meant was rarely clear, but at least it did not have hidden baggage known to all, Israelis or Palestinians, that would prevent creativity and flexibility in imagining possibilities for a future. So I am reminded of that now, as I try to ask these hard but important questions about the WCAA, including whether the WCAA has really been based on mutuality, or perhaps more, it has been based on the pursuit of mutuality, and if neither is really the case, perhaps the WCAA has been based on a strategic politics more than an ethics of being. I have used these terms before to try to think through the geopolitical and socioeconomic inequalities that contextualize us all as anthropologists, both in our roles as researchers or field workers, and in our roles as teachers, citizens, employees, evaluators, writers, planners, and responders to local, national, and international situations, and we typically do all of those things. That these terms may seem a bit vague is acceptable to me if they allow us to ask the hard questions. And I think they are questions that we simply must ask. For example, when I suggest that we contemplate whether the WCAA has been based in its first decade on mutuality, or possibly instead on the pursuit of mutuality, or perhaps even on neither thing, but instead on a strategic politics, I'm not necessarily criticizing the WCAA. I am, however, opening the door to consider the serious inequalities in size, funding, duties, influence, and position that characterize our countries, and to at least, to some extent, our own work as anthropologists because of our belonging to those countries, even when, like me, we belong to minoritized positions in those countries. Do we transcend the world's geopolitics just because we're anthropologists? I don't think any of us is that naive. I certainly don't think so. Does the WCAA try to create wedges, fractures, tremors, I kept imagining all sorts of images here, cracks, in those geopolitical patterns in which we live? Yes, I think, in fact, that's a very strong impetus, and I have little doubt that it tries and has tried to do that. But does the WCAA succeed in altering the landscape, at least of our profession's practices? That is, to me, the hard question. I think it is highly likely that it has taken steps in that direction and that its existence is very important. However, I also suspect that in the large hegemonic sectors of our profession, at least especially in the USA, few anthropologists have been very affected by the existence of the WCAA, and most of us who have been affected and changed in important ways are high-level leaders of the profession, look who's here, or anthropologists who are themselves transplants and not the great majority of our profession. One could say that a decade is not enough time for real change, and I think that's correct. One could also say that empires tend to assume that their systems and understandings are central, and that others tend to learn theirs, and not the other way around. And that, in my view, that tends to describe the great majority of the US anthropological profession. But we also know that many anthropologists focus their research and even much of their teaching on places outside the US. So the issue is frustrating because there is some level at which many US-based anthropologists do not see their double lives, their incongruity, and sadly their complicity with US imperial geopolitical assumptions, discourses, and practices. An excellent example remains the fact that few anthropologists in the US even know of the existence, I am sorry, Junji, of the IUAES, not to mention their far newer Wcaa. Add to that the fact that few US-based anthropologists seek to publish their work outside the US, or at least outside the Anglophone world. And then consider the fact that few anthropologists seek to present their work at international conferences, even when it doesn't really cost them all that much to attend. They may complain, but it doesn't. Or when they seem perfectly happy to spend the money in order to do fieldwork. So yes, I am concerned about inequality among us. The expected, the unchanged, the tacit, the surprising, and the challenge of pursuing a much stronger sense of mutuality. A particular historical moment brought about the existence of the Wcaa as a network, but as the Wcaa looks ahead, issues that pertain to the world that we live in, and not just the Wcaa, loom large. Among these are, 1, the role of nationness in our conception of the Wcaa's main units, 2, the unequal size of the Wcaa member organizations and the impact of size on influence and visibility. 3, hierarchies of power, implicit and explicit, within the world of anthropology. And 4, efforts to flatten those hierarchies, their relative successes and failures. At some level, I know that those of us in the room know and understand all of this, but let me pursue this a little further. While the Wcaa's first decade has seen great growth in the number of member organizations joining the Wcaa, I want to ask us here first if the Wcaa is not excluding many anthropologists, even in its efforts to be inclusive, precisely because its multinationalism leads it to seek a common denominator, an anthropology that is recognizable across multiple countries. We might use a phrase I heard a fair amount yesterday, a family resemblance, but notice I'm actually asking it pretty provocatively, if the Wcaa might not in fact be excluding many anthropologists precisely because it's sort of looking for a common denominator, that is an anthropologies, or something that is recognizable across multiple disciplines. Secondly, I want to ask us here if the Wcaa has really succeeded in promoting a more decentered anthropology than prior to its existence. And thirdly, I want to ask us here if the Wcaa is doing enough, despite the establishment of task forces in 2010 and the launching of ASF, Antropólogos Sem Fronteiras, Anthropologists Without Borders, in 2013. Let me return to the options with which I opened and lay out some possibilities. The pursuit of internationalization, the pursuit, notice the word, pursuit of multinationalism, transnationalism, polyloghy, and heterology. I also even added mutuality, if you heard what I was saying earlier, the pursuit of mutuality in strategic politics. Consider the pursuit of internationalization and even the pursuit of multinationalism and transnationalism. All of these entail thinking of the nation as the primary unit, and then the question is whether one is seeking the inter, or the multi, or the trans nation. But at the heart of all of these is, quote, the nation. There are advantages but also disadvantages to pursuing, quote, the nation as our main organizational unit. Some scholars have spent time, as I think you all know, over the past decade worrying about and critiquing what they call methodological nationalism. I even remember publishing a special section of the American Ethnologist when I was editor, some 8 years ago, on methodological nationalism. The issue there is more the question of how we, as scholars and specifically as anthropologists, think or ought to think about social processes, units, people, and phenomena when we are doing research, teaching, and writing. But is it not also the case that there are issues that the Wcaa has not yet adequately addressed, and perhaps that these are issues that the Wcaa has not yet adequately addressed, but that have to do with what I am here calling organizational nationalism, if not methodological nationalism. And we, in fact, do not apply this principle equally. While some countries, whether we call them nation states, countries, whatever, have one or at least a numerically very dominant professional association of anthropologists, others do not. And we don't even know how widespread that pattern is. We do know that we have several countries in the Wcaa represented by more than one anthropological association. For example, France, India, and Spain. The issue came up recently, with discussions of how many associations of anthropologists to have or even to allow per country in the Wcaa. You remember this discussion in November.
2 minutes.
While no one wants to dispute admission to this broad community of anthropologists around the globe, it remains a complicated issue that the Wcaa has not resolved. Among other things, for example, are we defining an organization by the nationness that is imagined or asserted or nurtured by its members rather than by something like membership in the United Nations? Are we seeking worldwide participation regardless of numbers and de facto privileging coverage rather than numbers? It should not be considered irrelevant or immaterial or even innocent when larger professional communities like the US, Canada, or perhaps even the UK are more restricted than smaller professional communities or even countries. The SFA, Society for Applied Anthropology, the SAA, Society for American Archaeology, and the AAPA, although Leslie tells me that she's actually talking to them about joining. But they're not members of the Wcaa. Should they be? Is a question. Should they not be? And if not, on what grounds? We, the Wcaa, do not seem to apply our implicit notion of organizational nationalism equally. But let us go further. Is our goal to talk to each other? And if so, how? For example, is it to talk to each other or also to listen to each other? And if it is the latter, is our goal explicitly or implicitly to accord each other equal respect as anthropologists? Can that happen when one language is considered the lingua franca, thereby limiting the active participation of anthropologists who either do not know English or are okay reading but not necessarily speaking and certainly not writing in English, or at least not doing so comfortably in their own eyes? Might our goal as the Wcaa, in fact, be more modest? That is, simply to acknowledge the existence of each other's organizations on the planet. If so, perhaps we have succeeded, like the UN tends to succeed, despite the US frequently complaining about this, as we know. Perhaps that sharing of space on an organizational, nation-based principle is not a bad place to start. But I have always sensed that many of us who started or who championed the Wcaa do not intend that to be its main or primary or end goal. I do believe that many of us seek to change some or many of our professional practices, to create an alternative to hegemonic or imperial patterns of value creation and promotion, and to have an effect not just on the smaller and not very geopolitically influential communities of anthropologists, but also on the big ones, the powerful ones, and the privileged, and the even hyper-privileged ones. But is that utopian? And do we even know who seeks what in this Wcaa network? Hence, I kind of want to have us think about Todorov. There are lots of problems with some of this work, but his notion of heterology appeals to me, not homology and not polylogy. It is about spotlighting difference, not assuming that we actually have a lot in common. It's about spotlighting difference and not just sameness, and we must continue to promote the facts that we are best described by our family resemblance and not by our caving in to one or another imperial pattern of naming and asserting value, agenda, and professional practices.
Thank you, Virginia. And now we will have Muggsy Spiegel.
Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you very much for having arranged this panel and for having invited me to contribute to it. I want to start off by relating a story from 1993, which I'm not sure if Junji was there, but it was the first AAA meeting I ever attended, having been sort of observed the boycott principles from South Africa until after 1990. And I showed up at the AAA meetings, and Jerry Eads, whom I'd met in the period had brought a. Were you part of that group, Chinji? Had come to the AAA with a number of, I think, students, or maybe they were junior academics, I'm not sure, who presented some papers at the AAA meeting, and they had a special session. And I went to it intrigued, but also drawn in by Jerry because I knew him. And at the end of it, I said, nobody knew who I was because I'd sort of come out of the blue from South Africa. And I said, that was really interesting, really well, so I was really grateful. But I said the one thing that worried me about this was that I'd come to a session which sounded as I might have, other than some accents, might have been just presented by a group of American postgraduate students. And I was looking for the Japanese twist. And little did I know what influence this would have. They didn't know who I was, but it came back, and I've heard since that they debated it at great length, this idea, what was the Japanese twist? And they were told, well, why didn't you ask him what the European twist was and the American twist? But what they should have asked me is what was the South African twist? Because I would have then been able to answer. The point, and the answer to that question about the European or the American twist is to say we need to find that twist and recognize that it is just another twist to whatever we're doing. And I think that's for me, is one of the driving principles behind this whole discussion of the World Council. Okay, enough of that background. Now we're going to get a bit more sort of personal history. But it's really around more administrative stuff. So let me start by saying officially a year ago the IUAS turned 65, just after the Manchester Congress, and the Wcaa is 10 years old. So there's a significant historical difference there. But the Congress in Manchester was very successful and seemed to be a significant turning point in the IUAS's recent history. Now, let me go through some of my own stuff. I'm standing here, as most of you will know, but some might not, as both an IUAS executive committee member. In fact, for the last now 11 or 12 years, I'm now the treasurer, and I'm also a member of the WCAA organising committee. That's for my 4-year term comes to an end in October. So I'm in those two. I came into the IUAS Executive Committee completely by default. I had no idea I'd been nominated. I wasn't there when it happened. I was elected. It was simply, I thought, because I'd agreed to offer an inter-Congress in 2006 in Cape Town, my offer had been accepted, and suddenly I got a message back from the then Secretary General saying my offer had been accepted, and I was now a member of the Executive Committee as well as a Vice President. Now, this kind of took me a bit by surprise, but I continued with it because I'm one of those people who, fool enough, when he gets put into a position, keeps on working at it. Now, I prepared that inter-Congress was for 2006, and during the time I was preparing it, the president of our regional association, ASNA at the time, contacted us on the executive of the association and said to us he'd been invited to Recife for a meeting something to do with presidents of associations, and would we be okay for him to go? And some of us were quite sort of hesitant. We didn't know what it was about. Now being a member of the IUAS Executive Committee, thought, what the hell is this about? And we've got something like that. Who are these guys? Anyway, I was sort of won over. I was outvoted, primarily because it didn't cost us any money for him to go. So we let him go and find out what was going on. But even when he came back, I was still very hesitant. He couldn't really explain quite what it was about and how different from the IUAS, which I was now a member of the Executive Committee. And so what was this about? And I subsequently learnt, as you saw from the images, Luis Vargas, and what Gustavo told us, Luis Vargas, the then president of the IUAS, had been at the meeting, but as a member of the Executive Committee, I had never been told that. I didn't know for a very long time because the Executive Committee hardly ever contacted each other. The organisation was run from out of Leiden by the Secretary General, and occasionally people would intervene. But for the most part, we didn't. We just didn't know we weren't kept in the loop. So I was resistant to it, and I raised concerns with Nas about it. I said, "What is this?" And he couldn't really tell me. I raised it again and that was the first time I ever met the rest of the executive committee, or some of them anyway, was in Pardubice in 2005. And I'd been on the executive committee for 2 years, and I didn't even know who these people were. And to this day, I don't know some of them because they've never shown up at anything, the people of that earlier executive committee. In Pardubice in 2005, there was a meeting of the executive committee, and one of the things which came out of that, there was question about this relationship because I wanted to know. And the minutes say the WCAA was understood to be a Latin American initiative overlapping with the IUAS. You heard, Latin American. Thomas, I'm not sure where your Latin America comes from. And John Gledhill. The IUS Executive Committee expressed its concerns with this new development, which is completely superfluous, except for the interactive website for anthropological information exchange. The WCAA should be part of the IUAS. This was at a time when the WCAA organizers understood the IUAS had become a member of the WCAA because Vargas had never said no. But within the IUAS, we never discussed it. This was as close as we came to it. As I began to, a little while later, to handle responses to the call for papers for that inter-Congress, there were these applications from Gustavo, Thomas, not Thomas, John Gledhill, and Junji. Thomas wasn't part of it. And they were 3 of these WCAA demons. And Gustavo will tell you how, when I first met them, I kind of thought, it was very aggressive. Who the hell are you to come and try and take over? But they won me over very quickly. I set up a meeting with somebody to mediate because I was frightened it would turn into a real unpleasant meeting. We didn't need the mediator. That was when Faye Harrison, around that time, made the point about the WCAA being one of the IUAS's best friend. She was one of the executive committee meeting members, like I was, and so we realized that we actually needed to work together. And we realized that the IUS would be helped, or the WCA would help the IUS to develop its own global and international, its goals to strengthen global and international relationships between organizations supporting our disciplines. I was by then really quite disillusioned with the IUAS, and there have been many moments as part of that IUAS executive where I thought it's time for me to get out of this. But being the fool I am, I stuck with it. Things were completely undemocratic. There was not even consultation. Things just happened. Now, so I was completely won over. Let me see where I can go, because I've written far too much to tell you the whole story that I've written here. But now what I was seeing in the WCAA was an organization that seemed to take seriously the goals of global networking and international collaboration through various representative organizations, and ensuring that the network and collaboration was such as to encourage high-level intellectual discussion and exchange in our discipline. The latter was a goal that was sought in the IUAS through its commissions, but it seemed to me, from what I could sense, but I didn't really know, that many of those commissions were pretty dead in the water. And we know that still is the case. There's some which have been really active, but the others they're just 1 or 2 people. And so it worried me terribly that I was involved in an organization which had no oomph. And now as WCA came along, and I was swung. Now, after our conference in 2006, there was relative quiet until the run-up to there was there was no further meeting. There was no executive committee meeting in Cape Town, and there was the run-up to the now infamous or famous, or whichever word you want to use, Kunming Congress, which was meant to happen in 2008, but it was postponed. Why? Well, let me read what I've written here. By the first half of 2008, prior to the originally planned date for the Kunming Conference, the WCAA network became increasingly important, particularly to me, as what I call the shenanigans that surrounded the planning of the Kunming Congress, its proximity to the then upcoming Olympic Games, And global concerns about Tibet resulted in a flurry of emails. Suddenly the EC, the Executive Committee, became active, in part. The President was silent throughout all of this. But it soon was silenced. There was a diktat from the Secretary General following a rather nasty email from somebody who was outside the committee, which should have just been, that person should have been sort of told off. But we were told we were not allowed to talk to each other about anything to do with Kunming on the email anymore. I'm not one of those people who's prepared to sit back in that sort of context, but this came down, and some people just weren't prepared to engage. And then the Chinese state closed down or said they were wanting to postpone the conference, the Congress. And this happened just at a moment when some of us on the Executive Committee had managed to negotiate the wording of a statement which could have gone out into the public about the Tibetan issue, about human rights concerns, with the organizers of the Kunming Congress. But that never saw light of day. So what this all did to me was it demonstrated to me the absolute need to transform the IUS from an organization that purported to represent the interests of anthropology globally, but appeared not to be able to meet that goal. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that, which I'm not going to go into now. What came out of that after that? So from that, there was because the Kunming Congress was meant to be in the middle of 2008, the Wcaa arranged to have a meeting in Osaka just prior to that. And by that point, I was not just on the IUAS, I was president of our regional Southern African Association. So I ended up coming to Osaka and became involved directly with the Wcaa. They were not just these friends, I was now part of the team. And it was the first Wcaa meeting I attended. And I sort of informed the Wcaa members about what was going on around Kunming, around the cancellation, everything I knew from the Executive Committee. And there was some extreme unease, if that's the best word for it, around the issues. Immediately after Osaka, I had to fly directly across the world to Leiden in Holland to another Executive Committee meeting, the first that it had been outside of any Congress, because there was a need to sort of work out what to do next. It was a very tense meeting, primarily around Kunming. But again, the question of the IUAS-WCAA relationship was raised. Somebody said the WCAA was trying to hijack the IUAS. And it was asserted once again that the IUAS could not be a member of the WCAA, and that the IUAS's president's attendance at the WCAA founding meeting had been meaningless in that respect. But we were supposed to prepare, he and I were now meant to prepare something for the next Executive Committee meeting in Kunming about how to work through the relationship. He once again went silent and nothing came of that. Now, during that time, at the Executive Committee meeting, we already were told that John Gledhill had offered to host the next Congress after Kunming in Manchester, and that was a glimmer of hope again. But there was a period in between, after Kunming, when it looked very dicey, and quite frankly, a number of us came close to resigning from the Executive Committee again, and partially because Nuss was who was the by then president, who'd been the Secretary General, was doing his usual thing, and I remained, and I think I convinced others to stay on because of John's offer. We didn't want to leave him in the lurch. How much more time have I got?
How much time?
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
I'm giving everybody an extra 2 minutes.
Oh, already, okay.
That's it.
Then let me jump to the end. I'm telling these stories about these tensions between the two, and I can continue to relate more of it. What I'm wanting to lead this up to is where do we go to in this relationship? Because quite frankly, for me, there's being in between these two, being on both, first having been the one to bring the two teams together in a way, then discovering the value of the WCAA. But I'm really concerned about having the public image of anthropology, the global public image, if we have two organizations, and that worries me. So having watched and participated closely in the developing relationship between the two organizations, it seems to me that the two do need to become increasingly close to the point over time, and possibly and hopefully by the time of the Congress in 2018, that we can become one. But for me, it needs to be something under a new name and a completely new structure. Secondly, I think that process of achieving that goal has to be taken incrementally. We can't do it suddenly. We can't say we're here now and in 2018 we're there. We have to kind of work together as two organizations in such a way that each organization maintains its distinct identity and organizational structure, but with a commitment to continually increase cooperation between the two, working to delineating the respective responsibilities, maintaining conviviality in all our efforts to reach agreement, if not consensus. So we have to create a mechanism to ensure articulation between the two organizations and a commitment to a mutually trusting process. And thirdly, a noteworthy facet of the structural differences between the two organizations is that they've created opportunities for new leaders of the IUAS to emerge. The WCAA has done that. The WCAA, because of its rapid turnover, even there's a rapid turnover of members of the WCAA, but even in the organizing committee, there's a relatively rapid turnover. And that has provided opportunities for the IUAS to draw from people. And I think it also, because the WCAA operates as it does, by drawing in leaders from local and regional organizations, you find people who can be then drawn into the kinds of work the WCAA does, but also into the work of the IUAS as it's presently constituted. I think if we bring these all together under an umbrella without sort of demolishing any of them, I think we can probably move forward very, very successfully. So I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Marcy. And now I invite Gordon Matthews to the podium. Please, Gordon.
Once more, Gustavo, thank you for organizing this. It's great to be here. I speak as a relatively lowly organizing committee member of WCA, not an executive, but I want to talk a little bit about some of its inner workings and some of the larger implications. The WCA as the United Nations of Anthropology, for better and for worse. The World Council of Anthropological Associations is an organization compiled of the presidents or representatives of different anthropological associations worldwide. It organizationally has something in common with the United Nations, although the stakes are, of course, much lower. Like the United Nations, the WCAA has high ideals. It seeks to place the world of disparate national and regional worlds of anthropology into a common global forum. And, like the United Nations, it suffers from, on the one hand, a possible excess of democracy, and on the other, apparently inevitable forms of structural domination. The WCAA needs to make policy decisions on a frequent basis in terms of offering new initiatives, supporting or not supporting a range of initiatives from the world of anthropology, admitting new members, organizing its conferences, and most broadly, promoting the global well-being of anthropology. However, because the terms of presidents of various anthropological associations around the world tends to be brief, 2 years is common, it's very difficult to attain continuity, as several people have already noted. There is a mailing list of WCAA delegates whereby all different association presidents or representatives are kept abreast of what's happening. There's also a full WCAA meeting once every 2 years or so, and interim meetings as well, so that an active delegate can indeed understand what's happening to the organization. But because of the rapid transition of presidents of national and regional associations, the new array of delegates at each WCA full meeting may have little fundamental idea of what WCA is about. Thus, there is always the danger of reinventing the wheel in WCA's deliberations. Presidents of national and regional associations are often too busy to pay much attention to WCAA's emails and website. And because they are more or less accustomed to being authorities within their own anthropological societies, when they're placed together in a new stage, the forum can be very difficult to manage. A training session for new representatives will be initiated at some point, but this is dependent on the venue provided by the host society sponsoring the WCA meetings. Complete mitigation of this problem seems structurally impossible by the very nature of WCAA as an assemblage of passing association presidents, transitional figures of authority soon enough to be replaced. The WCAA in this respect resembles the UN, whose various national delegates serve at the pleasure of their home regimes and come and go with those regimes. In the WCAA, like the UN, the way this problem has been overcome is for a few individuals to exert more authority. In the WCAA, this is done by the chairperson, elected every 2 years or so at full WCA meetings. Aiding the chairperson are the chairperson-elect, the secretary, the treasurer, and also the members of the WCA organizing committee, as formally specified by the Constitution on the WCA website. Much of the job of being on the WCA organizing committee is thankless. I can testify from personal experience, although I am somewhat lazier than most of my colleagues on the committee, involving matters such as arranging panel topics and programs for the full WCA meeting, arranging accommodations and dispersing and sometimes refusing funding for member delegates who otherwise would be unable to attend. And, as should be specified continually, this funding is provided through the Wenner-Gren Foundation, which makes possible the activities of WCA. If it weren't for this funding, WCA couldn't exist, at least not in its current form. I can say, from having been an organizing committee member for several years, that officers of the WCA are, as a rule, not in their position because of the pursuit of prestige or power, but rather from a sense of duty. There are tasks that must be done, and somebody has to do them. Despite this, however, there is a certain structural bias inherent in this process. The people elected as WCA office holders are those who have a continuing, ongoing presence in WCA. Who are such people? The typical delegate attending a WCA meeting is someone who serves a term as president of their national or regional association, comes to one or possibly two WCA full meetings, and then never appears again. If such a person is selected to the organizing committee, elected to the organizing committee, then they will indeed appear after their term has expired. But often their term as national or regional association president is so brief that they never really come to understand what is going on in WCA, and thus never run or are never approached to run for any office. I've not done a full empirical study on the matter, but it seems from my experience that aside from the chairperson, who typically is from a large national association, other office holders are people who are appointed as representative rather than elected as president of their home association, and are thus authorized to attend WCA meetings on a continual basis. Or they may be members of smaller associations where the same people may be recirculated. This situation enables certain people, simply through their continuity, to become more aware of what is going on in WCA and to take positions of authority. There's nothing improper or devious about this, but it's a structural consequence of the way WCA works. The UN has a somewhat similar situation, where long-term bureaucrats of the organization have their own immense power simply because they know how the system works, as outsiders do not. A more consequential distinction marking WCA office holders has to do with wealth. WCA office holders are likely to be from societies wealthy enough to enable them to attend meetings. There are no organizing committee members at present from anthropological associations in Africa or South Asia, for example, although there have been in the past. WCA does indeed finance those delegates who need financial help, with more funding going to those association delegates that most require it. A very scrupulous effort is made to ensure that this is the case. But this funding, as WCA grows in size, can only rarely be complete. The typical profile of an organizing committee member is thus of somebody from a relatively wealthy society. The organizing committee, it must be noted, is overwhelmingly white. The one member at present of non-white background is in fact from the Anthropological Association of Ireland, while the Asian representative from Hong Kong, me, is white. While there is not and should not be any ethnic litmus test, very clearly certain ethnicities do prevail. Why, to put the issue in its crudest possible form, are those who serve as office holders for WCAA typically rich and white? Good, I'm glad you're laughing. One key reason has to do with the basic composition of membership in WCAA. Because WCAA consists both of international and national anthropological associations, the exact geographical composition of its membership is not entirely clear. But what is clear is that roughly half of its member associations are from European nations or the European region. This is because there are so many European societies with anthropological associations, and a number with several anthropological associations. This is also because some other regions of the world are comparatively underrepresented. Africa, much of Asia, and Latin America as well are comparatively underrepresented. These regions certainly have a presence in WCAA, but not every country is represented. Most African countries do not have their own anthropological societies in WCAA, just as many Latin American countries do not. In Asia, Korea, and until recently China, have not been represented. The reasons for this are varied. China has not been involved because no anthropological association not affiliated with the government has been apparent until recently. Korean anthropologists do not, it seems, want to be in a world forum, although this may be changing. Let's see. And many African and Latin American countries do not have an anthropological association since they don't have enough anthropologists to form such an association. Like the United Nations, where every sovereign state can be a member and have voting rights in the General Assembly regardless of size, WCA does not distinguish its member associations by size in their voting rights. And thus, as noted, Europe is comparatively overrepresented, and other areas of the world are underrepresented. It would be absolutely false to suggest that voting for WCA office holders proceeds on an ethnic basis. Voting is clearly based on perception of whether or not given individuals will be suitable for the jobs at hand. But nonetheless, in an association half of whose members are European, voting still reflects this fact. The chairperson of WCA at present is a former president of the European Association of Social Anthropologists. The chairperson-elect is a former head of the American Anthropological Association, who was elected as chairperson of WCA, it must be noted, with a small degree of resistance from those WCA delegates who worried about American hegemony. Again, delegates choose WCA office holders generally on the basis of individual competence, not on the basis of national background. And so to overemphasize ethnic and national background would be silly. Yet it cannot be ignored for one key reason. Is WCA, in both its membership and its organizational leadership, replicating the same European-American hegemony over the rest of the world that has characterized anthropology as a whole throughout its existence? To put the matter extremely crudely, anthropology throughout its history has consisted of rich white people studying poor black, brown, and yellow people. Is WCA replicating this structure? I think it is. Not through ideological myopia of any sort, but simply because this is the state of global anthropology today, a state that WCA cannot fully transcend. Less developed societies have less developed anthropology. Anthropology is largely a luxury of wealthy countries. For who needs anthropology as an objective scientific discipline when there are other more pressing needs to be met, like food, clean water, basic education? Thus, it's hardly surprising that countries from the poorer half of global GDP rankings tend to be very much underrepresented as members of WCA, at WCA meetings, and as WCA office holders. It's a matter of national prestige for every country to have a UN representative. Even the poorest countries of the world proudly have their UN diplomats making speeches to that body in the world body. But this hardly extends to anthropology and to representation in WCA. The situation may be changing bit by bit, but it is indeed fair to say that anthropology as a discipline remains unnecessary for a significant proportion of people in the world. This is a major reason why WCA remains, to at least some extent, a rich countries club and a rich people's club. Despite all the laudable efforts of WCA to extend financial aid to its delegates on the basis of need. I might add that I certainly don't feel rich. I'm sure you don't feel rich, but at least by global standards, we undoubtedly are. Our discussant for this section, Takami Kuwayama, has written much about the world system of anthropology, whereby American and Western European anthropologies dominate other regions of the world, intellectually and institutionally, in ways that, in effect, intellectually force those anthropologists not from this center to conform to the center's intellectual dictates. WCA, despite the strenuous efforts of its office holders and member delegates to emphasize diversity, necessarily reflects this world system. Within WCAA, it is difficult to see how this could be remedied. Short of creating an affirmative action program for developing world anthropologies in WCAA, one that transcends funding alone, this problem cannot be solved. WCAA, like the UN, mirrors the world it finds itself in more than reshaping that world. The problem discussed in this paper is not simply a problem of WCAA, it is ultimately one of anthropology itself in its inequalities. WCAA can be remedied in this respect only when anthropology is remedied. This will indeed happen eventually. In 100 years, if anthropology survives, and it may not survive, it will be a discipline of everyone on the planet ethnographically studying everyone else, rather than rich people ethnographically studying poor people. But this hasn't happened yet. And while WCA can hasten this process to a limited degree, it cannot do much. WCAA, like the UN, is only a little more than a product of the world from which it comes. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's almost noon, so I hope that you are not getting too hungry and you still have a couple of minutes left to listen. I'm coming to this as a relative outsider, so I feel in a comfortable situation to say a lot of stupid things maybe because I don't know too much of the internal workings. But what I will be presenting is not so much my own view, but also how maybe other outsiders perceive the WCAA. And so I will be repeating some of the things which is, I think, unavoidable, but also maybe adding some new elements to the mix. And since we've heard a lot of words and people may be getting tired of words, I've also added some images to the mix. Not of the WCAA, but images that you can associate and feel free to associate in any possible manner you wish. Okay, so the title of my paper is not a mere play upon words. Crisis is one of the most significant buzzwords of our time, both inside and outside academia. There are many different understandings of crisis, both lexical and conceptual. The notion may be even utterly devalued through overuse. According to some, crises have been announced so often that the prospect of uninterrupted stability is much more disconcerting. And I'm talking about crisis because we've heard a lot of elements that point to crisis. Anthropology is in crisis, the WCA is in crisis. In this context, a fellow anthropologist, Ghassan Haj, recently traced how crisis has evolved from a concept of Marxist social critique to a discourse of neoliberal governmentality. Anthropology as a discipline has had its origins during a series of European crises, wars of religion and state formation, the beginnings of capitalism and industrialization, and the European exploration of colonization of large parts of the world. Anthropologists themselves have engaged in writings on the most diverse types of external crisis and on their discipline in crisis. The latter is related to issues of representation in the sense of speaking about as well as speaking for. Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions identified a strong emotive content besetting a community that is in crisis. According to Kuhn, explicit recognitions of breakdown are extremely rare, but the effects of crisis do not entirely depend upon its conscious recognition. In this paper, then, I want to reflect on the intersection between anthropology, representation, and crisis in the context of the WCAA's global leadership. The term representation embodies a range of meanings and interpretations. Etymologically, representation is a presentation of something, not by depicting it as it is, but by representing or constructing it in a new form and/or context. No representational forms are neutral, because it is impossible to divorce them from the culture and society that produces them. Many anthropologists are familiar with the scholarship on ethnographic writing and self-representation and the so-called crisis of representation, also known as the reflexive turn, that beset anthropology and related disciplines since the 1960s. This crisis was brought about by decolonization, anti-imperialist struggles, the civil rights movement, and the rise of third world nationalism. And it's very important to actually make the analogy between this historical period and what we are talking about here when we are analyzing the WCAA. Such changes on the macro level led anthropologists and other scholars in the hegemonic centers of knowledge production to reflect about their scientific practice and to consider alternative paradigms, the possibilities of more fully representing the complexity of social practices through alternative textual forms and performance and multi-person, multi-method research. Publications such as Writing Culture, we've all read it probably, made mostly Western anthropologists acutely aware of their unconscious reproduction of cultural representations. This implied that they had systematically misrepresented others and that the very act of representing otherness not only bears with it moral responsibility, but is also a form of domination. And again, think of the analogies. The modernist representational conventions of the discipline and the epistemological stances of cultural neutrality they supported were felt to be no longer credible. In other words, the crisis sharpened our awareness of the epistemological significance of presentation and representation. The crisis arose from uncertainty about adequate means of describing sociocultural reality. Instead, the anthropologist's own reflexivity, not to say self-doubt, and a preoccupation with the construction of representations became dominant. This opened up a moment for novel forms of writing that were more sensitive to the location of the author, the incompleteness of anthropological data, the necessarily dialogical and power-laden nature of fieldwork, and the polyvocality of any representation of culture. And I'm citing here from the work of Restrepo and Escobar that has already been mentioned before. However, some have wondered, have these new representations enabled a radical critique of the West, or have they become technologies for the domestication of alternity? According to other commentators, the real crisis resided in the reflexivist remedy itself. Moreover, as Gustavo and others rightly note, the sense of crisis that has become rather common among practitioners located in metropolitan centers is not found elsewhere. And this is something to keep in mind when we are talking about the issues that the WCA is dealing with. In fact, few crises around the world, in the world are truly global, although many are represented as such, particularly by people in hegemonic centers. And just link my talk to what the previous speaker has been saying. The recent economic crisis in many Western countries is a good illustration of how crisis is a social construct, a representation that reflects a particular point of view. With all the navel-gazing, some anthropologists have lost out of sight that the public understanding and representation of anthropology itself is perhaps not what it should be. A quarter of a century ago, the post-colonial scholar Gayatri Spivak made an important contribution to theories of representation by insisting that the concept, in a semiotic sense, must be reconsidered in connection with representation in politics, in the sense of any capacity for a person to be the agent of, to stand for, the will of other people. As Rosemary Coombe pointed out a decade later, The crisis of representation in anthropology and the crisis of representation in liberal legal thought share parallel histories and face similar challenges. It is interesting to apply this double interpretation of representation to the workings of the WCAA. I have the luxury of not needing to repeat the history and aims of the Council, as others have done this very eloquently before me. Like many organizations of its kind, the way the WCAA is organized and operates is based on the ideal of representative democracy. In this model of governance, representation is seen as the consequence of society's irreducible heterogeneity. So the principle of organization is the assumption of difference. A representative democratic system is founded on the principle of elected officials representing, thus acting or speaking on behalf of a group of people. This already poses some serious challenges for the WCAA. First, the Council, in principle the decision-making body of the organization, is composed of international delegates. These are designated and authorized by the member associations. While the WCAA constitution suggests that these delegates are typically the current president or an executive member of the member associations, there is little information, let stand control, over how these people were elected in their respective associations. Some may not have been elected democratically at all. Moreover, there is a wide variation regarding the terms of office, and we've already heard this, ranging from one-year positions to people who are president for life. Having only one WCAA general meeting every 2 years does not facilitate, and this is again also something that we have heard, the continuity. Second, WCAA international delegates are supposed to represent the constituency of their respective associations and to communicate their wishes to the Council. According to the delegate model of representation, which is a model of representative democracy, delegates have no autonomy from their constituency. As representatives, they act essentially as the voice of those who are literally not present. The word delegate may not be the correct term in the case of the WCAA, because representatives do use their own judgment in the exercise of their powers. In reality, they act as more like trustees. And this is not just a little linguistic play, but this is thinking about the legal models that we are using. Moreover, the WCAA member associations are very unequal, and this is also something that has already been mentioned. There are also marked differences regarding the type of individual membership. While many WCAA member associations serve primarily academic anthropologists, others have a larger constituency. And I'm thinking here about some models in Latin America, like in Argentina, where actually the associations also include anthropologists working outside academia. In addition, the borders of the various associational constituencies are not delineated clearly. And the WCAA does not distinguish much between the categories of international and national member associations in its decision-making structures. Being myself a member of IUAES, EASA, and the AAA, I am clearly overrepresented, while others are not represented at all. And I must also add that I'm from Belgium, a country with a very important history in anthropology, but a country that actually currently has no national association. So if I would not be a member of these other associations, the WCA would be meaningless, at least for me. There are some additional issues too. A general drawback to the governance structures modeled on representative democracy is that delegates are not required to fulfill promises made before their election. As is common in such models, the WCAA international delegates are entitled to nominate or self-nominate for various offices within the WCAA. Chair, deputy chair, treasurer, secretary, and ordinary member of the organizing committee. These are forms of what is called indirect representation. The WCAA constitution does not mention anything about the WCAA task forces. How are people in these task forces elected, and for how long? Whom do they represent, if anybody at all? To whom are they accountable? Moreover, organizing committee members are allowed to combine their role with the one of international delegate. It is thus perfectly possible to cumulate various roles, being a delegate for multiple associations and or taking up roles in the organizing committee, which can lead to confusion or worse, conflicts of interest when it comes to representation. The imminent danger that representative systems in general deteriorate towards an oligarchy has been noted more than a century ago. Others argue that representation is, right from the start, the exact contrary of democracy. In any case, if not taken seriously, the challenges of representative democracy can lead to a very different type of crisis of representation and consequently legitimacy, leading to a decline of trust in institutions such as the WCAA. After all, the degree of satisfaction with representation itself, not necessarily with the results of the system, which is another matter, depends largely on institutional design. This should be kept in mind when considering how to improve the Council's structure and functioning. And I'm slowly coming to conclusion here, because I see that Gustavo is looking at his watch. 2 minutes, yeah. 4 minutes. I think I will have enough with 2. As I have briefly illustrated in this paper, there are various types of crises with which anthropologists and their leadership have to deal. Any crisis is a new challenge, but also an opportunity, such as the crisis of representation in anthropology has shown. No wonder that some have likened crisis to the intellectual equivalent of Pavlov's bell. On hearing it, scholars slaver uncontrollably, thinking of the self-aggrandizing opportunities arising from a serious disciplinary rupture, or an organizational rupture, you could say, in the case of the WCA and the IUAS and all the other relations with associations. At the same time, we should realize that crises are always contextualized. Unfortunately, there is a tendency either to imagine that what happens in mostly metropolitan context again is representative of what has happened in the rest of the world, or what sooner or later will happen there, or alternatively to assume that their interpretations have universal value. In its 10 years, the WCAA, together with initiatives such as the World Anthropologists Network, has made many anthropologists aware of the global dimensions of the discipline. As anthropology is further spreading across the globe, and the discipline's leadership and government structures are increasingly global too, we should not stop asking ourselves, who is, meaning belongs to or represents anthropology? Of whom and for whom are bodies such as the WCAA speaking? Which mechanisms are needed to make the WCAA more representative, if that is what we want? Recognizing that not all anthropological associations are positioned equally with within the power structures of the discipline. Which voice to give to anthropologists in places without national or regional anthropological associations? Is representative democracy really the most adequate model? And importantly, how to assure that the WCAA consults, deliberates, or makes decisions about challenges within anthropology, not necessarily academic anthropology, as much as about the multiple crises anthropologists are facing in the world outside of the discipline. The issues discussed in this paper show that the answers are not as straightforward as some people think they are. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, please, Francine Saillant, take the podium.
So I would like to talk a little bit more about theory and little less about organization and the structural organization of the WCAA. The proposition presented by Escobar and Ribeiro in their book World Anthropologies in 2006 contain the key elements of what can be called the core program of the association. I am borrowing them directly from the book, and I am interested in two of those propositions. The first was the idea of developing a plural landscape of anthropologies, less shaped by the metropolitan hegemonism and more open to the heteroglossic potential of globalization. And the other one, to write from no particular national point of view. In their programmatic book, Ribeiro, and Escobar acknowledged the tremendous difficulty of developing a common intellectual program for the WCAA project, given that such a project runs the risk of reproducing an undesirable effect of hegemony. The recognition of alternative epistemologies, or alter epistemologies, is indeed far from being a settled matter. This is precisely the question I would like to discuss here. Whether or not they join the project of the WCAA, word anthropologies are observed to be emerging all over the world in the context of various socio-political transformations. It is important to recognize that these anthropologies are stemmed from the result of political movements, regimes in Latin America, the development of knowledge institutions in Asia, the greater circulation of intellectuals, and the growing cosmopolitanism of scholarly associations. Without such openness, the movement of post-colonial studies in Asia and Latin America would never have seen the light of day. The WCAA network gives these anthropologies ever greater visibility as well as greater credibility or prominence. The different forms of globalization taking place in the scientific field also underlie those prevailing in anthropology. Indeed, the word anthropologies are moving in step with globalized science. In universities across the world, neoliberalism is putting pressure on individuals and structures with a view to compelling a greater internationalization of knowledge. In the eyes of those who evaluate institutions, local productions have become increasingly suspect. Because they are local and cannot be incorporated into fashionable rankings, they are suspected of inbreeding and lack of scope. What we, in the language of the WCAA, call word is viewed as local in the neoliberal regime of academic institutions. The pluridirectional cosmopolitanism of the WCAA's project is inevitably, in spite of itself, embedded in the obtuse internationalism of neoliberal structures. Neoliberal pressures is also being exerted in another way. The anthropologies practiced in the countries of hegemonies, France, England, and United States, are struggling everywhere today with the rise of the biosciences, the neurosciences, engineering, and so on. The directions these countries are taking in terms of scientific policy, including Canada, I am Canadian, are not favorable to the social sciences and even less to anthropology, which is seen as the least scientific of the social sciences. Indeed, anthropology is accused of being useless or too ideological. It is categorized as belonging to another era that is useless or obsolete. I would suggest the metaphor of the rhinoceros walking on a tightrope, as in the logo of the Cascade 2014, to present the way our discipline is often too much judged. Yet, these ideas are completely disconnected from the discipline's theoretical developments over the past 15 years. Indeed, anthropology has succeeded in renewing itself more than any other social sciences, and sociology in particular. The World Council must remain attentive to this situation. The question of the discipline's obsolescence is entirely ideological and reveals a profound ignorance on behalf of those who make such a judgment. I will not address this subject here. However, the questions of the discipline's supposed uselessness can also be put into relation with studies group growing demand for results. The transformations expected to arise from certain projects are not always within the reach of anthropologists, even if they are sensitive to these issues, and even if the matter of the impact of our work is increasingly an ethical requirement of our ethics boards and our national organizations. For their part, the word anthropologies, for much longer than those of the hegemonic anthropologies, have been subject to the requirement of social usefulness, if only for obvious economic reasons. Yet the question arises of whether we will be able to answer for our knowledge acts over and beyond the standard means of research available to us, which are more than ever being depleted in the context of neoliberal organization. Let us now look at things from another perspective. In all kinds of different places and context, there is in fact a call for a more practical, more relevant, and less logarithmic science. From the standpoint of a globalized and symmetrical anthropology, that is, an anthropology that brings together knowledge projects on diversity without distinguishing between the nature of the objects of at home and out there anthropology, and I would add an hegemonic and alter anthropology, it is important to define this discipline's usefulness. Indeed, we must define our usefulness, but without undermining the discipline's strong program of polycentric knowledge from the most diverse perspectives on the world, objects, people, nature, and ourselves, acquired using a range of sophisticated methods of situational observation and dense description, which Piet, for example, refers to as phenography. Some grounds need to be covered before this question of usefulness becomes credible on an ethical level rather than equating with idiotic utilitarianism and before it becomes widely understandable. The effort to define a strong program for a globalized and symmetrical anthropology combining advanced theory and transformational aim is still to come. Why not conceive an empirical scientific program for the Wcaa on the scale of well-known international projects in the hard sciences? The global sciences, that is, the hard sciences of hegemony, that are the core of scientific policies and large teams with funding, have growing needs for big data, for projects requiring ultra-sophisticated technology, thinking about the boson, the Higgs, the human genome, space conquest, and all that, and for international teams. The sharing of technologies is fundamental to the hard sciences as they are developing today. In the face of what is big, expensive, and just as abstract as what we are doing, although we are not that much expensive, we must demonstrate the ambitious magnitude of our disciplinary project, the ways it has recently redefined itself, its requirements, and its scope. In my view, we do not spend enough time explaining the discipline's requirements, its philosophical and practical scope. There is an opportunity to be seized here, and the context offered by the Wcaa is unique in this respect. Must we limit ourselves to defending the discipline at the national level, to defending the national anthropologies, or to defending the disciplines in the context of an internationalization of the conditions under which science is being conducted today? Anthropology associations, hand in hand, could take the floor to give a name to this shared and singular knowledge project. Whereas before there was discussion on the unity of man, at the time, today we might speak on the intrinsic diversity of world of existences and perspectives. This diversity could be grasped with a view to overcoming Western universalism and joining the project of a new universalism, at once critical, like Monder Killaney is talking about, and symmetrical, like Latour is also discussing. The word anthropologies must answer the question, who are we together with other existence now that we no longer want a world divided into geopolitical and geocultural sectors and halves? More than ever, anthropology is breaking away from the project of the Enlightenment. I am thinking of the symmetrical anthropology of Latour and its iconoclast, of the perspectivism of Vivero de Castro, on the phenography of Piet, on the model anthropology of Laplantine, of the phenomenology of Ingold and Jackson, and of many others that, albeit in different ways, are joining the project of indigenous, Indian, African, and other anthropologies. The intense discussion, perhaps overly intense, some might say, around ontologies appear absolutely revolutionary for the discipline, and in my view, they can be amalgamated with the current theoretical project of the word anthropologies and with its post-colonial, post-ethnographic, plurivocal, and polycentric context. The word anthropologies carry within them words that assert and confirm the absolute diversity of existence and modes of existence, and with them the diversity of perspectives. This is completely at odds with neoliberal globalization and offers a key ingredient for resistance. This is certain cornerstone ideas, such as questioning in terms of representations. You are representation, we are realities, nature, perspectivism, and the end of homocentrism. Culture, there is no longer technical objects and human beings, but existence and actance. Time, the concepts of covalence, co-presence, space, the landscapes, and so on, can only inform few of the new complexities that we are broken down, obvious cultural truths, and the binary construction of others. Anthropology is showing a growing recognition of words made up of existent, within which God's technologies, humans, and natural elements are no longer separable, regardless of the words. In the past, one might have said cultures involved. It seems to me that the word anthropologies have their say at the heart of the disciplinary theoretical project that is being reshaped, a project which, in many ways and from a variety of horizons, it's breaking away from its Westernism, and also a project that is more than ever connected with indigenous cosmologies and localities.
2 minutes.
It's okay. It will be respected.
Thank you.
The project is also ultimately challenging its own roots, Western rationality, but without crushing the agenda of knowledge. The intent is to make sure that knowledge in itself is made of multiple ontological perspectives on the same object, and that this knowledge is well reasoned and discussed. The project of the word anthropologies can, in this way, become even more ambitious and more incisive, especially since these perspectives are an intrinsic part of the word anthropologies because they are precisely its subject of study. Will the project of the word anthropologies latch onto the modernity of the old anthropological project born in the 19th century with the nations? Or will it come closer to the basis of indigeneity by linking it with the anthropologies of the 21st century? Of course, I am being provocative. Over and beyond the national anthropologies, there are the anthropologies of the world that they cover and that are the subjects of ethnographies. National anthropologies are not just association of anthropologies. They are territories of the worlds they map out and represent, put into circulation and bring into increasingly global knowledge. Latour and others suggest that the knowledge stemming from the diverse world we approach should be made symmetrical. They should be on equal footing. In my view, this also means coming closer to what others, and in particular Escobar and Ribeiro, have called alter modernity. That is, a post-colonialism free of bitterness. Vivero de Castro, for his part, has contributed to the pluri-perspectives, which makes it possible to do justice to the radical project of recognition, not just the diversity composed of the self and the other in a given world, but also the intrinsic diversity of words with an S. What I suggest is to bring these two forms of converging anthropologies closer together, post-colonial and ontological, and to consider that the project of the world anthropologies is located somewhere between the two perspectives. But for all sorts of reasons, it has not been able to fully develop. Ontological approaches have neglected national anthropologies, which they deem to be too preoccupied with indigenous people and not enough with their peers.
Sorry,
and word
Francine.
is finished. And word anthropologies are perhaps still too national or nationalizing or too modern. It remains to be seen. Vivero de Castro points us in an interesting direction by recalling in Cannibal Metaphysics our transnational condition. Our discourse is conceptually co-determined by the discourse of those who are the subject of our discourse. This means that the science that we produce locally is never universal and that we are condemned to localism. The consequence is likely that our future lies in this exchange, initiated around these localities and indigeneities, these alter modernities and alter rationalities. A recognition of our condition, adjusted in this way, could only allow us to more strongly assume our position. Thank you.
Thanks, Francine. And now we have the last intervention by Professor Takemi Kuwayama.
In the interest of time, and because it's almost lunchtime, I will skip some or many of the comments I have prepared. But I want to begin with this story because maybe most of you do not know. Back in 2002, I attended the annual meetings of the American Anthropological Association held in New Orleans. There was a decision or rather session called something like the Internationalization of Anthropology, which was held in a large ballroom. June Nash and George Stocking Jr. were on the panel with some other distinguished anthropologists. Apparently, the program committee expected a large audience. As it turned out, however, only about 30 people showed up, and the ballroom looked almost empty, and I found it embarrassing. And furthermore, many of the people who did show up were non-Americans, including myself. And because I had lived in the United States for 11 years as a permanent resident, I knew that Americans were not very enthusiastic about internationalization, but I innocently assumed that there would be a larger audience. Despite the small audience size, there were some personal rewards. During the question and session or answer period, I was able to speak up in front of the dignitaries. And I was also lucky to meet Gustavo, who later played a leading role in the formation of Wcaa. So 10 or so years have passed since then, and during that time, the Wcaa was created and its membership is steadily growing. And this in itself is a great accomplishment. And also the American Anthropological Association, the largest one in the world, has taken the initiative instead of just waiting to see what might happen. In the project of internationalizing or globalizing anthropology, and as many of you know, a new section called World Anthropology, which I think should be World Anthropologies in the plural. But anyway, it opened in a March issue of American Anthropologist, the flagship journal. And in the first issue appeared 3 articles, 2 of which were written by the people, as far as I remember, who attended the New Orleans conference, Gustavo and Alf Hannertz. And I'd add here just a few words on Andrew Spiegel's paper, which I received just the day before yesterday. Now, he said that at the moment when the Wcaa emerged, concerns had been raised among some IUA executives about 2 organizations working in parallel. Now, seen from their side, the emergent Wcaa was a new kid on the block. Now, I can imagine how they felt, but we should remember that similar organizations are often created at different times in different places on different grounds. Moreover, new ones may stimulate the growth of or rebirth of old ones, which for one reason or another have been stagnant. As Spiegel remarked, the Wcaa is probably the IUA's best friend, if not marriage partner. So how to maintain and improve their relationships is an issue that confronts the leader or future leaderships of both organizations. So we have come a long way from the New Orleans conference, or even earlier. But many important problems remain to be solved, as today's presentations have made clear. And among them, the first issue I want to take up is Gordon Matthews' view of the Wcaa as a sort of the United Nations. I think this is well put, because the Wcaa is basically made up of national associations. Indeed, the constituent unit is primarily a nation, secondarily a region, and in other few cases, an international body like the IUAES. As Matthews pointed out, now from this structure come, on the one hand, a possible excess of democracy among the members, and on the other, the possibility of domination by a few strong members. Excessive democracy might result in chaos, whereas complete domination would end up in silence. In reality, neither one is likely to happen. But in my mind, a world in which many different voices are heard, even if it is chaotic, is far more sensible than the one just one or a few hegemonic voices are heard. Now, Matthews was correct when he said that the Wcaa must think about how to be administratively effective and at the same time, how to be democratic open. However, he may have gone too far when he said that the Wcaa's officers are overwhelmingly white. And let me remind you that the second chair was Junji Koizumi. I must also point out that there are different shades in the same color, and the meanings attached are socially constructed, not a given. And it is unlikely that my friend Gordon was unaware of this, so I think he played the devil's role intentionally, just to give us food for thought. Now, Matthew's concerns were shared with Virginia Dominguez. As she pointed out, many of the problems the Wcaa is facing come from its structure as an assemblage of mostly national associations. Now, among these, Dominguez took up the unequal size of member associations and its impact on each association's influence and visibility, as well as the concomitant hierarchies of power within the Wcaa. So these are enough to make us wonder if the WCAA is not ironically replicating or even reproducing on a larger scale the world system of anthropology, in my own terminology, despite its initial goal of creating equal partnerships around the globe. Dominguez talked about nationness and organizational nationalism, and there is no room, there's no doubt that a narrow-minded nationalism is out of place in international endeavors like the WCAA. Now, one related issue that has not been adequately discussed today is that of how to represent at the WCAA the internal diversity that exists within a national association. No academic association, if it is big enough to be called that, is as homogeneous as to be represented by a single tradition or school of thought. The WCAA should always keep this in mind because its leadership consists of high-profile people who probably come from the mainstream of their own national associations. So if the internal hierarchy of power is carried over into the WCAA, then this organization would someday be turned into a rich people's club. Now, in this regard, quick turnover in the leadership, which Matthews deplored, may actually be a good sign of democratic openness. Now, the issue of representation was discussed today by Noel Salazar. If I'm a lecturer in English, the term represent has two main meanings. One is to describe someone or something, and the other is to speak for somebody. And George Marcus's and Michael Fisher's book, Anthropology as Cultural Critique, addressed as a rule problems relating to the first meaning of the term, that is description, whereas writing culture addressed by and large problems relating to the second meaning, that is speaking for someone. So when representation is an issue at the WCAA, I guess it is almost always in the second meaning of the term. Therefore, the leadership should ask themselves these questions. Who speaks? Who speaks for whom? Who speaks for whom? For what purposes? Pragmatic concerns about the management of the WCAA should not overwhelm these conceptual concerns. And finally, let me speak briefly about language. This is a topic the last presenter was supposed to speak, but in the interest of time, she skipped it. Recently, the American Anthropological Association, of which I have been a loyal member for more than 25 years, there was an experiment in multiculturalism in which 3 languages, English, French, and Portuguese, were used simultaneously. Based on this and other experiences of her own, Salient suggested, or should have suggested, the possibility of moving from the use of lingua franca, which is English today, to multilingualism or plurilingualism. I understand this point, but for speakers of non-European languages, this may turn out to be a blessing in disguise. And I give here 2 reasons. The first has to do with the question of selection. Because it is impossible to represent all the languages in the world, only major ones like those used officially at the United Nations will probably be selected for use. That is not fair to speakers of other languages. And the second reason has to do with the burden to be placed on people who already have language problems. Take the example of Japan. We are already struggling with English, and it is impractical for us, most of us, to study other languages just to do anthropology. So in my mind, a truly useful approach to this issue that will benefit many people in the long run is to foster respect for the different ways today's lingua franca is used. Even in the Anglophone world, English is used differently by different people with different backgrounds. The situation is more so outside the English-speaking world. Once this fact is clearly recognized and is carefully attended to, when journal editors, for example, review articles submitted from faraway places, the results will be dramatically different than when judged by the editor's own standards. Put otherwise, even if the content is the same, depending on how to phrase it, including what kinds of theories and methods are used, the referee's evaluation will be quite different. Therefore, and this is my conclusion, diversifying a single major lingua franca rather than multiplying minor lingua francas seems to me the best solution to the complex issue of language. And at least this should be tried together with other attempts like the 2PS project of multilingualism. Thank you.
I'm sure that we would love to engage in debates because this was a very exciting session. The two sessions were very complementary because the first ones, of course, were visions from people that are engaged in the project and have many responsibilities within the WCAA and its future. And the second one, we were lucky to have a lot of criticisms and suggestions that are very relevant to further think the missions and operations of the WCAA. But I'm afraid that we will not be able to do this right now because we're running late. And we have to reconvene at 1:30 here. So it's already 12:16, and so we have only 1 hour to have lunch. I would say that we should stop and come back at 1:30. Thank you.